Admission Chat is brought to you by the Standard Application Online. Save 14 hours or more when applying to at least 3 private schools. Start saving time today at admission.org/apply.
Welcome to Admission Chat. Let's talk about fairness and standardized testing. Greetings, I'm Darren Worcester, and in this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Keith Wright, VP of Psychometrics and Assessments at the Enrollment Management Association, who leads the development of SSAT testing. Keith, thank you for joining me today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Darren. Looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Let's kind of start kicking it off by having you tell us a little about yourself and your career in assessments and psychometrics for EMA.
That's a great question, Darren. And when I think back to my career, I would put my career into 3 buckets. I started off in electronic engineering software development as a software design engineer. Then I fell in love with, just being back in higher ed. I started teaching engineering courses. And so I transitioned from being in the technology field, going back into academics, again, teaching engineering courses. And while in academics, I said to myself, if this is a place where I want to stay, I probably need to get a PhD degree. The question was, I had been out of my Master's of Science in Computer Science graduate degree for about, I think at that point, maybe 8 years. So the thought of doing a doctoral degree in computer science wasn't that appealing, just because I knew it would be very challenging. The graduate degree in and of itself was challenging. And so I said, what do I love? So I love education, I love math and computer science. And that's an excellent blend for psychometrics. And that's what I do at EMA. And so that was the doctoral degree, and that's how I ended up at EMA from a psychometrics assessment perspective.
That's interesting. I actually really was wondering how, it's such a specified niche, how you kind of got down that road. So for our discussion today, we're talking about fairness and standardized testing, specifically the SSAT. And as we know, standardized tests such as the SSAT are part of the candidate review process for many schools. They aren't, we're very quick to say they aren't the end all and be all for decision making, but they are a piece of the admissions pie that helps schools identify whether students will be a good fit for their programs. With all your time and experience here, why do you feel the SSAT is a necessary component in a fair and equitable applicant review process?
Another great question. So I'm going to have to go back to the PhD degree because I would not consider me being at EMA a very specific decision that I made. It happened haphazardly. And what I mean by that is during my doctoral degree in psychometrics, I was very, very interested in the area of standardized testing or assessment within education. I'm a lifelong learner. I think education, of course, is extremely important for many reasons. Most importantly, it helps you. It can definitely change the trajectory of your life and those outcomes. I really wanted to have a better understanding of whether or not standardized testing, whether or not they were fair. Being from the city of Chicago, south side of Chicago, where I attended Chicago Public Schools, I really wasn't sure. I didn't really have a good answer to that question on whether or not standardized testing was fair. And so my entire doctoral program was centered around trying to answer that question. If you know anything about a doctoral program, you look at a lot of literature, there's a lot of research, and it's very scientific in terms of approach in which you try to answer any research question, the methodologies that are used. My specific area in my doctoral program was differential item functioning. That's a statistical technique that looks at whether or not test items differ for one group of kids versus another group. So you can group them by gender ethnicity, so forth and so on. And so after that, quite honestly, when I went into that research investigation, and you should never go into a research investigation with, say, for instance, your mind set on the answer that you think you're going to get. Well, I did not get the answer that I thought I would get. And the answer was, yes, standardized testing is fair. And so when we speak of fairness in testing, well, it's not the test that's not fair. One thing I've learned being at EMA for the last almost now 10 years, the development process in which we use, the rigorous process in terms of how we determine scores, the test administration of the test, and the score reporting, all of that is very, very rigorous, standardized, and fair. So a test in and of itself cannot not be fair. Maybe I can say that there's been an overuse and inappropriate use of test scores, but tests measure what they're supposed to measure. They're supposed to measure one's cognitive ability in math, verbal reasoning, and reading comprehension. And one thing, again, I can say that, it's not the test that's not fair. The process is extremely fair.
Keith, you just surprised me there. I want to make sure I understood that correctly. So you actually approached this originally anticipating that you were going to find that tests weren't fair. Did I understand that correctly?
100% accurate. My entire research inquiry when I went into my doctoral program was to prove that standardized testing was not fair. So if I say my hypothesis wasn't a null hypothesis because I had already accepted, what I would consider the alternative hypothesis, right? So a null hypothesis is you're trying to answer the question. You don't make a determination yet until you determine what the research yields. And so, of course, it was a fair process that I undertook in terms of the research inquiry. But at the end of the day, I concluded, and the only reasonable thing based on objective research that I could conclude was the test is fair. It's not the test that's not fair. Maybe it's the human actors involved in how they go about looking at scores, but the test in and of itself is fair.
So would it be fair to say, you being involved in this industry now is a can't beat 'em, join 'em approach?
Absolutely. And my mission is to ensure that everything we do at EMA is to ensure fairness from A through Z related to everything we do around developing our assessments.
One outcome of the pandemic that we've seen is a shift to test optional admissions for some schools. As an semi-objective observer from the outside, what has always puzzled me about this is how do they objectively evaluate a student's academic performance or cognitive abilities? When folks say we're shifting away, they often say, well, we've got grades and we've got GPA as an alternative to standardized testing. But with grades, the part that confuses me is you often have two teachers in the same school teaching the same course, grading differently. One may offer tests while the other puts more emphasis on essays. One may offer extra credit while the other doesn't. So you can have two students of the same abilities, coming out of that school with widely different grades in the same subject. So if grading can be different in the same school, just the thought of how widely they vary across the world just blows my mind. This is a very long-winded way to ask you what I think is probably a rhetorical question. Is there a realistic alternative out there to objectively evaluate a student's cognitive abilities?
As you said yourself, how is it that you can have grades being used now, or even grade point averages being used objectively? Can grades and grade point averages be a replacement over standardized testing? And when I think about it is when you look at all the information that's in the student's application file, a lot of it is subjective. And so when we look at objectivity and what are the objective pieces of information in that student's application file, the only objective information would be anything that was standardized. And so when you think of grades and grade point averages, That's just not standardized. Standardized testing, and the reason we call it standardized is because it's standardized as related to the development of the test, the administration of the test, the scoring of the test, and the score reporting of the test. All those components are standardized, hence objective. When you look at grades, and to your point, we can even take, two students in the same classroom with the same teacher. And I can argue that the grades that one student get over another student from that same teacher in that same classroom could be subjective, right? Because you have, unfortunately, a human actor involved. Now, I'm not saying there's some nefarious activities taking place with this teacher. No, I think we all come with our own biases, and good or bad. Even how we assess students. I can say that because I've been in a classroom. I've been a teacher. So we try to have objectivity, but there are many factors that can happen throughout, say, for instance, that semester that can create bias in your mind as a teacher with one student over another, good or bad. And so grades and grade point averages, Darren, as you just pointed out, they're not objective. They're very subjective, and they're not equal. And that's not just for me. Research has demonstrated that as well. And just take it even more extreme from what you said. You didn't even give an extreme example. Just take me coming from Chicago Public Schools versus another student coming, say, for instance, from a school like Andover at Exeter. So you think that the courses that I took in my school are going to compare to the courses from Andover and Exeter? It's impossible.
That's a very good point. And I want to follow up on that one in a second. So hold on to that thought. Staying in the vein of, the grading discrepancy, from what I've seen, I think it also creates confusion amongst parents and others when it comes to taking standardized testing. I've done the research. I've seen the chat board and the Facebook comments where, parents have a child that does great in school. They get good grades. They're attentive. They, by all measures, they're doing well. They're a good student. And nobody would say they're not a good student. But then they take the SSAT and they don't score as high as what the parent would expect them to score based on what they know of their child and their performance in school. The natural fallback for them, because they don't understand it, is to say, well, the SSAT must be biased. We know the opposite is true. Your team goes to painstaking lengths, as you've mentioned already, to ensure questions are fair for all test takers. And I was kind of hoping we could use this time for you to walk us through the life cycle of an SSAT question. Let's kind of let everybody understand that, what happens in this process? How are they created? What checks and balances do they go through? You mentioned, you got into this trying to prove that tests weren't fair, and, now you're in it to make sure that they are. So, what is it we're doing to ensure that the questions on the test aren't biased in some way?
Great question. It's going to take a while to go through that rigorous process, Darren. So hopefully you have time, and hopefully, the listeners can visualize what I'm trying to articulate. But as you said, it's a rigorous process. I would argue that it takes over a year to develop one test form for the SSAT. And so it's an iterative process. And so we're developing test items and test forms on a regular basis.
Can you define what a form is to make sure everybody understands that?
So a test form is a complete SSAT form that consists of the 50 questions for the quantitative section, 40 questions for the reading section, and the 60 verbal questions for the verbal section. So that's an entire SSAT form.
Okay, so basically it's the version of the test that you would be taking.
Absolutely.
Awesome. I'm sorry to get you off base.
No, that's important to help keep me honest with respect to some acronyms that I may be using, just because I'm so familiar with these terms. And so, again, it could take almost a year just to develop one form, unlike me when I was teaching could develop the final exam in a week. So, not to go back to your previous point with respect to, grades and grade point averages, well, I can tell you, I could develop a final exam for a course in a week, week and a half. That's not the case for, say, for instance, a well-developed standardized test or assessment. It takes a year because of the number of steps that are involved in that process. So first, we have to start with content, right? So we have content experts, and we use the actual teachers in our independent private schools to develop our test questions. The reason that is because it's called content validity. So we would not want, say, for instance, public school teachers developing test items for kids that are going to be in independent private school classrooms. They don't know the content. They don't know the difficulty level that would be expected. So we utilize teachers in the schools themselves to write the test questions. Now, of course, these teachers are not expert in the test development process, which there's research and there's a methodology you go through even in developing, say, for instance, standardized test items. So we have our staff, our expert test developers, working with these teachers to develop the test items. Once these test items are developed, they have to determine the difficulty level of these test items. And so they have this subjective and somewhat subjective when they're determining the difficulty level, because they're saying, okay, based on what I know I'm teaching in this class, I think this question is going to be at a medium difficulty level, or this is going to be a very hard question, say, for instance, for this seventh grader. So then we actually test it in the field with the students, and that's called pre-testing. So before these test items even count for real scores, they get field tested or pre-tested with students who are trying to answer these questions. So statistically, we get almost perfect precision as related to the difficulty level of these test items. After, say, for instance, we do pre-testing, we get our item statistics on the difficulty level on these questions. We also look to determine if these questions created any issues from how students may interpret the question. So questions get removed all the time if they don't pass our rigorous statistical process. And after they pass that pre-testing process, then they go through another review with our test developers before they're even assembled on a test form where they are then administered for actual scores that are going to count.
Now, as I understand it, in those review processes, you guys are specifically looking for, any potential for regional or cultural biases in the questions. Is that correct?
Yeah, but that's done before they're even field tested. We even go through that rigorous process, Darren, before they're even field tested, because that's called our fairness review. So our staff, our expert test developers, they ensure all of that stuff has already been taken care of before they're even pre-tested and field tested.
Okay. And the field testing, is that the experimental section at the end of the SSAT that some students take? So families know your students take the SSAT, and sometimes is it a 15-minute section at the end where they're answering questions, but they're not getting scored on them, and that's our pre-work to make sure those questions are going to be good. That's
excellent. That's correct. And those questions appear towards the end of the SSAT. And we get excellent, because, these students take it very seriously as related to taking the SSAT. They put the same effort into answering those pretest questions as they would the actual questions that are going to count. And so our statistics that we get back are excellent with respect to making a determination on the difficulty level of these questions, because we often look at the pretest statistics, and then when these same questions are then administered on a form where they're going to count, these statistics match almost perfectly.
Thank you for explaining that and breaking it down. I know for me coming into EMA, I was a student that didn't necessarily love standardized tests, so I didn't necessarily have the most positive opinion of it either, but understanding what they go through and, everything that you guys put into it has definitely, for one, changed my impression of the whole piece.
Yeah, and I could raise my hand and say I'm with you on that, Darren. Hence, the whole PhD investigation.
Yeah, that was a bombshell for me in this one. I didn't realize that's how you had gotten into it. I do feel like, Keith, that we can't objectively have this conversation and say that we're objectively having it without acknowledging the elephant in the standardized tests room. And you actually alluded to this earlier, and I tabled it. So let's go back to it. But that's the fact that the SSAT is an assessment for student readiness in, what we know are rigorous private and independent school academic programs. As such, students who are already enrolled in these schools, maybe a middle school student testing up for high school, or who have the means to hire a tutor, have an inherent advantage. So what are some of the things that we do at EMA to level the playing field from an economic standpoint?
Another elephant in the room, let's acknowledge it's going to be very difficult for EMA to correct the ills of society wholeheartedly, right? But there are things that we do to try to assist traditionally underrepresented students. But before I even speak about what those things are, let's first address and not penalize students who parents have the resources to provide those additional educational enrichment opportunities, right? That's what we should do as parents. And those students who get that additional enrichment opportunities, they're going to just be able to learn more and go in to take in, any type of assessment with a bit more confidence, right? And I look at, I think you used the term prep. I look at it as, just think about even in K through 12 public schools where they have, after school programs. Well, that's the purpose of after school programs, because you typically cannot get everything that's needed. And, whatever the time period is for that day in school, I've been out of school for a while, so I don't remember, but I know it was like maybe from 8:30 a.m. until, the bell was ringing at 4:00. I don't remember. But you need to have things outside of the classroom to help you continue to move forward in your educational journey and to enhance your educational outcomes. I don't want to dismiss the importance of after school programs. You call it test prep. I call it, getting more instructional time with learning algebra and geometry and studying vocabulary words, increasing my vocabulary, right? And my reading comprehension ability. So that in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It is just part of the academic program for those students. And so it's important. So what do we do to try to say, for instance, mitigate some of these societal ills out there? Because it's the, societal factors that create the differences in standardized testing scores. So let's recognize that, right? And that's why I think it's really important. And this discussion is very personal to me, because I think we focus so much on the test and not on the societal factors that's creating the disparity. And so when we do that, we're not holding those who we should be holding accountable, such as our political leaders, our educators, even the families who we need to hold accountable to what needs to happen as well to ensure all students have an opportunity to be successful. But what we do at EMA, we have an excellent practice portal program where we have developed this practice portal to give students an opportunity to get exposure and familiar with the content. Say, for instance, on the SSAT, the difficulty level of, say, for instance, the content on the SSAT. Oftentimes, for traditionally underrepresented students, they can access the practice portal free, and they can use this to enhance some of their test-taking skills and just refresh, say, for instance, their memory and get more knowledge about different topics in algebra and geometry, so forth and so on. We have a fee waiver program where, we allow students who qualify for the fee waiver program to be able to take the test for free. And I think very importantly, since my time at EMA, would be the education related to the use of standardized scores. And so I do a lot of speaking to schools, to the admission professionals and their offices related to this discussion right here, Darren, right? So what is a standardized test score? How is it developed? What does this score mean? How should I interpret this score? Just helping, say, for instance, admission professionals understand that there isn't really a huge difference between, say, for instance, an 80th percentile and a 90th percentile. I know families even probably put too much emphasis on those differences, whereas statistically, it's not really a great difference there, right? And so understanding how to interpret this test scores and use it holistically with the other information, those are all the things we do at EMA. Again, our practice portal, fee waiver program, very important to me is the education related, say, for instance, to how do you interpret and use these scores holistically in admission decisions.
So how I imagine that you've hit on some very important topics there. I imagine how that is playing out. You use the example of large public school systems where maybe the resources and the opportunities aren't as great. Is that basically, and to use your percentile example, is that, helping admissions folks understand that, hey, a kid that scored an 80% in a public school system, that's, in a large city without the same resources, that is excellent, and shows a lot of promise and should be right up there with a student that, had all these academic advantages that got a 90%. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Spot on, 100%.
Excellent. So I do think people sometimes get, a little carried away with looking at the percentages. Talk to the school and understand how they're interpreting that data and how they're using it, that they aren't necessarily just looking at it as a flatline score and that's all they look at.
A lot of this discussion, Darren, I can just look at myself personally, right? So me coming out of, Chicago public schools, I was an excellent student, honor roll student. I was in gifted architectural program. So coming out of high school, I thought I was in the top 3% of my class, but my score did not suggest that. It should not have suggested that I was this top student because I didn't even know I had to take a standardized test to go to college, and I was going to college. So there you go. I had 2 weeks to prepare for taking the ACT. And so how do you think I did with only 2 weeks of prep time when my counselor told me, you're going to college, Keith, right? And I was like, 100%. She said, well, you have to take this test. I was like, what test? So there you go. Right. So my score did not reflect, say, for instance, my ability, but I did need some extra opportunities in my first year to catch up because my school didn't have pre-calculus. And so that put me at a disadvantage wanting to move into engineering. So, it just took me about a semester to catch up. But once I was able to catch up, I was on par with my other peers. But just think about it. If, say, for instance, I was not given that opportunity to go into, additional courses, that could have really discouraged me if I was thrown right into the deep water without this opportunity to get on par with my other peers who came from more highly resourced institutions from a K through 12 perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I share the experience coming out of a public school system and not having felt like, in hindsight, seeing all the prep that a lot of students do, feeling like I really did put in the legwork or even knew to put in the legwork, to prep for the SSAT or, the SAT at that point. The one other thing I do want to clarify, you talked about fee waivers, just to make clear so everybody understands, a fee waiver does, allow them to register for the SSAT and get the online practice for free. Somebody wants to see if they qualify for a fee waiver. How do they go about getting one?
I don't know the exact process there, right? So that's another department within EMA. But I do know that they can speak to, say, for instance, the school that they're working with in terms of, whether or not they can get a fee waiver. There's a process that's involved. I'm not sure of all the different, say, for instance, criteria that's used to determine whether or not one is eligible for a fee waiver or not. But I know over the years, we have given over millions in fee waivers. So what that process is, Darren, and the criteria, that's another department that would be able to answer that question.
Yeah, you hit on the key factors there, being that they ultimately families inquire with the schools. EMA doesn't distribute fee waivers directly. We are funding them, but we don't distribute them directly. So if for families that are, interested, contact the school, talk to them, and they will kind of walk you through that part of the process. So Keith, I just have one last question, one last critique of standardized tests that I feel like we need to address here. And that's in regards to, the SSAT being a predictor of future success. And, one of the critique of that is that, well, it only looks at cognitive abilities and not necessarily other qualities such as work ethic, teamwork, etc. That can certainly contribute to, how successful someone is as they move on to other chapters in their life. What's your viewpoint on that?
I agree with it. And again,
you agree with it?
I agree with it because as someone that I would consider myself a left-brained, right? So not to stereotype any one person, but I love math. So being in engineering and computer science, I can relate to this because we had to work really hard. My research institutions like Bell Labs, where I worked at, because you had a bunch of smart people there from MIT, Georgia Tech, and these high-performing engineering schools. So that's who I worked with at Bell Labs. And so we were cognitively capable in math, but did we like to work together in teams and all that, all the non-cognitive stuff that I think about, right? Probably not. So we have to develop those skills, but it's very important. I would say that we need those non-cognitive factors. They're just as important, arguably, some would say more important than the cognitive, right? But I don't like to say one is more important than the other. I say always cognitive plus character. And so when I speak of character, I'm speaking about, some of those non-cognitive factors that's important that research has shown they are important for one's success in their academic pursuit, right? So we speak of teamwork, resilience, intellectual engagement, initiative, open-mindedness. All those non-cognitive factors play a role in one's success. And that's why at EMA, we embrace and highly encourage all of our member schools to consider holistic admissions, where they're not just looking at the cognitive piece, but also the non-cognitive piece. They both are important. And I can go back all the way back when Dr. Martin Luther King said, one of his quotes was, "We must remember that intelligence is not enough. It's intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education." And that's where I am as well. And from my entire tenure at EMA, I've encouraged holistic admissions, not just looking at one piece of, say, for instance, that application file.
And when you say holistic, you're talking the interview, you're talking the recommendations, you're talking everything down the line. But your team has also developed a complementary assessment for the SSAT to look at exactly that, at character, correct?
That's correct. It's called the snapshot. And so we have to be careful when we say character, right? Because we're not assessing a student's character from the perspective of of when we think of one's character, right? So these would be just what I would consider, I like to use the term, we often use the term, we use it interchangeably, but it's really non-cognitive factors. Or if you look at what we call it in the workplace, soft skills, right? Those soft skills. I would also parallel non-cognitive factors in education to what we consider in the workplace, soft skills, that a lot of employers are putting even more emphasis on because, again, they're hiring individuals with exceptional skills from a cognitive perspective, but they're lacking those soft skills. And as you know, if we don't have teamwork, if we don't have collaboration and all that stuff, we're not going to be successful. So yes, we developed an assessment to look at those non-cognitive factors that we feel are very important. I have to give credit to our schools. Our schools came to us and said, EMA, help us with trying to assess what we're trying to assess without a standardized measure. So schools were trying to assess these non-cognitive factors themselves, but they understood that they all had different approaches, and that probably wasn't fair. So you needed a standardized approach to say, for instance, to measure these important non-cognitive factors. And that's where Snapshot was born out of, really from the schools approaching EMA. And we said, yes, that's very important. And we were very excited go down that journey. And I'm excited to say that I think Snapshot is an important assessment as well to provide that additional piece of information that's not cognitive, Darren, as you just mentioned.
Excellent. Yeah. So I'll throw a plug in there and say that families can go to admission.org to learn more about the character skills snapshot. And, we've kind of come full circle. We started out, saying that the SSAT wasn't the end all be all, that it was part of a holistic admissions process. And, at the end of our conversation, kind of reiterating that and showing, the other ways that we're looking at it. So, Keith, I really appreciate you doing the conversation with me today. This has been very enlightening, and I'm sure, a lot of families will find it helpful to really understand, the why and the how behind standardized testing. And a lot of work goes into, taking the test and preparing for the test for families. So I think we owe it to them to understand, what this is all about. So thank you for breaking it all down for us today.
Great. And thank you, Darren. And just let me say, I was really excited to do this podcast with you because it's my love for education as to the reason why I am in the field that I am in. Thank you.
And for all the families, we wish you all the best in the admissions process. Thank you for listening to this episode of Admission Chat, and stay tuned. We'll have more episodes coming soon.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Admission Chat podcast. Admission Chat is a production of the Enrollment Management Association. For more EMA resources to help families throughout the private school application process, visit admission.org.